Feeling lost and lonely in this world? The good news is that God has given us a GPS, that is the God Positioning System, to find our way through life, God's Word. Welcome to the Bible GPS podcast, where you'll discover that the Bible's message is just as clear, compelling, and current as when it was written. Now, here are your hosts, Cobus Jennis and Labai McCalligan.
It's a huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Willie McLeod for the third time on our podcast and our YouTube channel. I just wanted to welcome him. We really look forward to the discussion. Something that I didn't mention with the previous podcast is that Willie did write a book on the ancient world from which the Bible originates. And on top of that, he's published a number of peer-review articles. Cobus, I bet you're just as excited as me about this podcast.
Yeah, I do learn a lot. I learn all those things that I've missed a few classes when I was a student. So Willie's making up for it. So thank you very much for that, Willie. Yeah, I'm ready now to just soak it in. So that is very good. So Willie, there's a lot of skepticism in society when it comes to the reliability of the Bible, because people will say, and today will be our archaeological approach. People say there's no enough evidence. There's a lack of evidence from the world of archaeology to support the historical stories of the Bible. How will you answer someone like that who is skeptical and say there's a lack of evidence from the world of archaeology?
It's a pleasure to be with you guys again. And the topic of archaeology is actually extremely interesting, and it's closely related to our topic of discussion the previous time. We spoke at that in that podcast on the hermeneutical approach towards the Bible. And when it comes to archaeology and the archaeological approach to the Bible, it's extremely important to understand the reach of archaeology as a discipline. So from a philosophy of science perspective, which is my background, I'm always interested in the reach of the reach of science, of a scientific discipline, and what is possible and not possible in a particular discipline. From a Kantian perspective, I'm also a Kantian philosopher. You guys who are philosophers would know that one of the major efforts of Kant in his critique of pure reason was to establish the boundaries of reason, of pure reason, when it comes to judgment, determinate judgment. So when we want to say that something is true or not true, then it depends. There are certain restrictions to our pure reason in coming to such conclusions. Now, the same is true regarding archaeology. Archaeology as a science is often viewed as an empirical science. Now, it's true that archaeology involves empirical studies. That simply means that we are handling artifacts, we're engaging on a physical level with items on the ground, etc., etc. But, and this is extremely important, although it's empirical in the empirical discipline, the question is whether it's truly an empirical science. Now, the reason why one should make this distinction is very important. And when it comes to an empirical science, we also include repeatable experiments. So when it comes to archaeology, that's just not the case. The digs are non-repeatable, a kind of non-repeatable experience. When one have two different archaeologists working on different sites, there's some things that surely can be in common between the sites, and one can compare it and so forth. But any particular dig is a non-repeatable experience. What is also true is that archaeology does not include a controlled experiment. Now, that's very, very important. This means that we cannot really talk about a representative sample in archaeology. So if there's not a representative sample, how do we know when we find or not find something on the ground, whether it's expected to be found or not to be found?
Mm.
So if it's a representative sample, as in all the empirical sciences, we know if there were, say, for example, 100 of these items in the original historical reality, we will find, say, 1 or 2 or whatsoever. So there's a certain statistical chance that we will find certain items.
So it leaves, so it actually leaves room for interpretation on the archaeologist side as well, which can be limiting.
Interpretation is always important in all disciplines. But what this means, and this is extremely important, there's a big gap between the historical reality, the world of the Bible, for example, and the excavated reality. So when the archaeologists go and dig in a particular tell and he studies what he finds on the ground, then there's a gap between what he finds today and the historical world. And he has no way to know whether what he finds today in his dig is a realistic or similar sample than that which existed in the historical world. So many things that did exist in the historical world will never show up in the excavated dig because they don't exist anymore.
Willie, if I can ask you, so it seems to me the archaeological approach is a bit limited because it's so far removed from when the events happened. And how does that relate to the reliability of Scripture?
Yeah, so this is extremely important to understand that this discipline has very important limits. Now, in the previous discussion, we talked about the positivist period. That was a period when people believed, scientists believed, that if we cannot positively establish that certain evidence occurred, then it did not occur. Then that event did not happen. So they expected a positive evidence without which they did not accept the possibility or the fact that a certain historical event occurred. But the problem is, if archaeology is not an empirical science, as I've just mentioned and shown in why I'm saying that, then we have a problem. Because many items and things from the ancient world will never show up in the archaeological excavation. So we have absolutely no way to determine if something is not found, whether it happened or did not happen. So if we have a literary text that say certain events happened, etc., and we go and look for equivalent evidence in archaeology, when it comes to larger things, for example, cities, let's say the city of Babylon and so forth, then it's much easier because we can look for a whole city. But when we're going to look for a particular historical person, let's take Abraham. How are we going to determine whether Abraham really lived or not, whether he was an historical person? What kind of evidence do we expect to find regarding the historical Abraham if he did live, in fact, in the past? That's the question. What is the kind of evidence that we can expect? Now, in this case, in Abraham's case, we have, and that's extremely important in archaeology, is indirect evidence. So often in archaeology, because we do not have direct evidence available for many, many major events throughout history, that is generally known in archaeology. What archaeologists do is to look at the background conditions. They look for indirect confirmation. It's not too different. In a certain sense, we find something similar in physics where, for example, the Big Bang is beyond empirical reach. There's no possibility that we could ever, on an empirical level, engage with the Big Bang. But we have certain indirect evidence that we take into consideration, and from that, scientists would say, okay, we believe in the Big Bang. So it's the same thing that we have here. We have indirect evidence. And because of that period in history, when scientists and biblical scholars had this idea that we cannot believe the Bible, and the Bible is not historically reliable if there's not evidence for everything discussed and said in the Bible, they developed a general perspective that the Bible is not historically reliable because of a lack of evidence. But since that time, the world of archaeology and biblical studies has evolved a lot. And we know today that it's just plain wrong to say that if we have not found certain evidence, that's evidence that something did not happen. It's just not true, and it's very wrong. You can't say
Willie,
that.
With the previous podcast, we did sort of refer back to the modernist and postmodernist views. Now, with regard to archaeology, can you sort of expand on the modernist and postmodernist approaches to archaeology and the value or non-value of each of those approaches?
Yeah, so what we find in archaeology, obviously, we're not in a modernist period anymore. During the modernist period, there was that view that all the disciplines trying to establish themselves as sciences. So they tried to achieve a certain kind of objectivity. And in that effort to obtain that kind of objectivity, they believed that the scientist or the observer have a kind of objective view on the world. So they've tried to find objective facts. And this is where the positive perspective came in. So if that facts were not available, then they believed we cannot trust the tradition telling those stories about those events, for example, the biblical tradition. In the postmodernist period, there's a reaction against that. People don't believe that that is available to us, that kind of objective perspective. So the reaction against that was that everybody just believes, or that scientists believe, that everybody has a different perspective. Now, the same is true in archaeology. There's postmodernist archaeology where scientists or archaeologists believe that when we study certain excavations or archaeological data, that everybody will just form his own opinion. Now, there's an element of truth in the sense that, as you've mentioned, Labai, we always interpret the data. We always interpret the archaeological dig and the evidence that we find in the dig. And in that sense, we often find that archaeologists have different views. I can mention this quote by Vance Vatros. I think it's a very interesting quote. He said, one of the most interesting things, he himself is an archaeologist, and he says, one of the most interesting things about archaeological material is you get the same object. You get three archaeologists. You come up with three different interpretations based on that. So I think in the postmodernist period, this problem is taken to its extreme. And it's believed that we cannot form a decisive opinion about or narrative about history. And in the end of the day, everybody will look at history and at archaeology and at the evidence in a different way. And there's no such a thing as truth about history or about archaeology in that sense. Now, I believe that this is taking it too far. So although we cannot obtain an objective perspective, we can obtain better narratives. In the very first discussion that we had on this program, we discussed better narratives. So it's different to formulate different narratives. When we have all the data, so we have certain texts, take for example, certain texts, and we have certain archaeological evidence, and we take everything into consideration, then we can formulate different narratives. But all of these do not have the same value. Some of these are actually quite bad. They're not true. They're not good narratives. So we must be able to distinguish between narratives that we should reject, and better narratives that we can accept. When it comes to better narratives, often we cannot make a final decision on which narrative is really the right one. Both 2 or 3 different narratives might be true because we just restricted in our access to evidence, etc. But we can exclude some of the narratives. So when it comes to the Bible, and this is extremely important, we can produce a good narrative showing that the Bible is consistent with what we find in terms of the texts as well as the archaeological data. So what we find is the Bible is consistent, and we have good evidence supporting the biblical story. And we can formulate a narrative consistent with the biblical story, which is a good narrative. And what is important is to show that this narrative is better than some other narratives in which skeptics say that the Bible is untrue, that it's not reliable, it's not trustworthy. So their narrative is sometimes quite popular. But when there's a discussion and we really take that narrative and seriously consider and carefully consider all the aspects, I believe that we can always show, most instances as far as we have available data, etc., that the biblical narrative is a good narrative. We can make a good case for the trustworthiness of the Bible. Let me give an example. Many examples can be given, but let me give one example. There was a stage where most biblical scholars, critical scholars from the biblical criticism stream, believed that David was not a historical person. They believed it. So they were quite sure that David never, there were no such a person in history called David. And it became an established view in scholarly circles. Biblical scholars did not believe that David ever existed. Then something happened. During a dig in the north of Israel was discovered a stela that was since called the Tel Dan stela. And on this stela is a reference to the house of David. It's from the 9th century BC. So suddenly these scholars that were absolutely sure of their case and believed that David was not an historical person and that the biblical stories is totally unreliable, they had to engage with this fact that reference is made about 100, 200, 150 years after David of the house of David. Then some of these scholars says, no, this is fraudulent. This, we cannot believe this Tel Dan stela. These guys has, in a fraudulent way, tried to produce this evidence. So the next year when the excavators went back and they did the rest of their dig, there was a certain part of the Tel Dan stela broken off. And while they were digging, they found this piece. And they brought it. It fit exactly to the rest. So now, okay, today everybody accepts the Tel Dan stela as established above, I think, reasonable doubt. Well, there's still a critical scholars that tries everything possible to discredit even that evidence because they don't like it and they don't want to believe it. But I think in general, most scholars, archaeologists and biblical scholars would say they believe that it's good evidence that David really existed as an historical person. So that just gives you an example how it works in this field.
Yeah.
So,
it's almost like, sorry, go ahead, Quibus.
No, you can go ahead, but Lebay.
No, I just, it's almost like, you're standing in front of a judge and you present the least possible evidence, and based on that least possible evidence, a judge needs to express whether someone's guilty or not guilty, which is seriously concerning. I hope I never end up in a court like that.
Yeah, so they disregard the biblical tradition, the biblical criticism scholars. They totally disregard it. They don't believe the biblical tradition is trustworthy. And the problem is that although they're not positivist in their perspective anymore, most of them, and the field has developed, those ideas and those views that had been established during those positivist times and modernist times have become widely accepted to this day. So the scholars still operate under those views established during that period when the scholars had this totally wrong perspective on archaeology and the biblical text. But those views has become established in the scholarly community, and that's the reason. Even though the philosophical approach of the scholars has changed, that groundwork done by the previous scholars had been accepted. And the field, in my view, that's why we find this bias in the field of biblical criticism.
Willie, is it fair to say that there's no archaeological evidence at this moment to contradict the narratives of the Bible, the ancient stories?
As far as I know, there's no evidence going against the biblical stories and what we find in the biblical tradition. Many of those things are not easy to prove if you want to bring evidence, direct evidence that this or that happened. And sometimes there are different views among archaeologists. For example, at Megiddo, scholars or archaeologists would differ whether the kind of structures that we find truly date from Solomon's time or not. It's quite established that it dates from Solomon's times and it's consistent with the description in the Bible, but some scholars do not agree with that, some archaeologists. So this is the problem. There's always different views and different interpretations and different perspectives regarding these things. But I believe, and this is what is important, we can formulate a good narrative using a lot of evidence that is supportive of the biblical tradition. And we can do that for most periods throughout history. So sometimes it's more difficult. Take, for example, the Abrahamic period. I've referred to Abram, and Abram is to me extremely interesting because I've written a book on that in that period, and at a later stage we can discuss it maybe in more detail. Yep. But one of the things that's interesting is that in the story of Abram, reference is made to the Elamitic incursion towards the northern parts of Syria and towards the Dead Sea. Now, this incursion has been established to have really happened, and it's also found in other non- or extra-biblical texts, for example, in the Elamitic texts that had been discovered not too long ago, actually. So these extra-biblical texts confirm what the Bible says, that such an incursion of the Elamites did take place during that period. And in the chronology of the ancient Middle East, I've published a new chronology. In that chronology, this event is exactly in the period that we expect that Abram was living in Canaan. So this is indirect evidence. But what is important about this evidence, it's surely impossible for somebody living in the exilic period or thereafter to have known about this incursion. How on earth would such a person know about it? If there was not a solid tradition going back to the historical event when that took place. So it's not a direct evidence that Abram was a physical person, but it shows that the story, the whole thing, Genesis, includes evidence that can be shown to be true. And there's a lot of other evidence. It will take some time to discuss everything. But the point is that I want to make is there's good evidence supporting the biblical narrative. And that's, in my opinion, it's true for all periods, even in regards to the primeval history. That's Genesis 1 to 11, extremely interesting, because that goes back, in my view, even before the first writing occurs. So we're talking about really tradition. But we can compare that with the Sumerian tradition about that early period. And in the Sumerian tradition, we find a consistency between the literary tradition, what is written in the literary tradition, and what is found on the ground. And that supports a certain view of Sumerian history, which is consistent with the story in the Bible. So it's slightly complex matters, but it shows that the biblical story can be believed.
That's very encouraging.
And I must qualify myself because it depends on also how we read the text, how we understand it, etc., etc. But there's a way to read and understand it that makes sense, and in my view is a good, solid, or a good narrative, with good evidence.
Yeah, so what you can basically say, if you look at the role of tradition, you look at texts and artifacts, it paints a picture, and you have to look at the overall picture to at the end of the day come up with, I want to say a judgment call.
Yeah, so you have to consider when we study the biblical story, and we'd like to see there's any evidence supporting it. Then we look at other texts from that period, and we look at all kinds of supporting evidence from that period. Evidence that is in agreement with what we find in the Bible, and text that is in agreement with the story told in the Bible. So when we have something like the Tel Dan Stela, that's wonderful, but it's not always available because of the restricted reach of archaeology as a science, as we have discussed right at the beginning. So if we do not have the right or the correct understanding of archaeology as a science, then we have a much more critical view because we have a wrong understanding. We think we should find these things, otherwise they did not happen. But this is the wrong view. We cannot go with that. No good philosopher or no philosopher of science would at all go with that in our current day and situation. So, but once we have a correct understanding of what archaeology can and cannot do as a discipline, what is the kind of reach that it has, then in that context, when we gather all our evidence and we formulate a certain narrative regarding how biblical events unfolded, say, for example, about anything that we can, the Exodus or so, then once we have that narrative, we must compare that narrative with other similar narratives. Now, many of these narratives are critical. So what they say is, no, the Exodus didn't happen. So they give their reasons why they believe the Exodus did not happen. So now we must compare narratives. So when it comes to a court case, you've mentioned the justice system. In the justice system, we have exactly this. And in that article, I actually propose that the justice system is used as an analogy to understand how archaeology operates or should operate. And what we find in the justice system is that different narratives are brought before the court. I've talked about that also the previous time. So now we have, say, for example, two. The one is very critical about the Bible and the biblical story. The other one is supportive of the biblical story. So when we have these two narratives, then we must try and decide which one is a better narrative. Now, in the end of the day, there's nobody that... Some people would think, okay, the scholars should decide. But the scholars are not the ones to decide. When we have a court case, then we have expert witnesses. They come in and they give some evidence. But at the end of the day, it's not the expert witnesses that make a decision. It's the judge or the jury. And that's extremely important. Because in South Africa, we have, for example, had a case where an expert witness, in one murder case, his testimony was just accepted and the court did not really query it. But in the other case, in another murder case, his testimony were taken apart. And suddenly most people would ask, in that other case where that guy testified, why did we believe him? So many scholars, they're experts in their field, but they come from a certain perspective. They have a certain paradigm, scholarly paradigm with which they operate. And they have, take for example, they come from a critical school. Then their perspective and their view would be very critical regarding the biblical truth, you see. So that's why it's important in the justice system, in a court case, that we take all things into consideration. We have the forensic evidence, which agrees with, for example, physical artifacts, etc., that's found, historical data. And then we have testimonies, try to determine which are good testimonies, reliable witnesses. In the same way, we have testimonies from biblical times. It's not, we can't take them into cross-examination, but we have these testimonies and these ways. There are ways to really consider their trustworthiness, which is also a wide open field. We've discussed that to some extent last week or the previous time. But so what is important is we, the informed reader, should be the judge. We should not leave that to other people to decide for us whether it's true or not.
And I think that's a big problem we're currently facing, is that we get taught and educated to basically look at what so-called experts present and just accept it on face value without any judgment. And it's this whole thing around you're denying the science,
what often happens is that the critical view is somehow regarded as a scientific view. So the more critical you are, the more scientific you are in some way. I don't know how that happens, but it happens. So what you'll find, for example, is that quite often, on Wikipedia or and so forth, what we'll often find is that the critical view is presented as the only scientific view. And this is just not right. Mm-hmm. It's not right. It's not correct. It can't work like that. But they restrict, in many cases, in their presentation of history, they only present, or in many cases, only present it as scientifically acceptable, the really critical view. So this is really problematic, I think.
Willie, I do have one other question as well. So if you look at academia currently, do we still see remnants of that modernist and even postmodernist approach? When you look at
Absolutely, yeah. Many academics, especially in the field of biblical studies and even archaeologists, often those that are truly skeptical. And what they usually do is, the reason why they're so skeptical, in most cases, Finkelstein, for example, is a very well-known Israeli archaeologist. He's very skeptical. He's quite known for that perspective. But what has been said about him is this: he do not accept something as a real possibility if there's no evidence. So this is basically the positivist view. So he's holding the positivist view. And this view, which is not accepted in philosophy of science circles at all, is now sold as the scientific view. How on earth do you get to that? Just because he's so critical, he must be a good scientist. That's totally wrong. But this is how many people think.
Lebay, if we can just wrap up, I just want to summarize what I've heard, and Willie, please confirm or just change a little bit what I've said. But what I heard is that the archaeological approach really support the story, the ancient stories of the Bible. It doesn't discredit that, but there are gaps. It's a limited approach. So we don't need to worry that if we read the Bible, it's not supported by archaeology. It is indeed support. We have good stories. We don't have all the stories, but we have good stories. And at the Bible GPS Institute, Willie, we use the slogan of that the unknown future can only be navigated through the compass of an ancient text. And this ancient text, and you are an expert on this and the philosophy of science, you just confirmed to us that this ancient text, the Bible, can indeed be or is indeed our compass because it's reliable and it is trustworthy. So we can continue reading our Bibles with so much comfort and know that how the Bible came into being was indeed an amazing miracle from God.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and
Yes.
sorry, go ahead, Willie.
No, that's okay.
No. I just wanted to agree with Quibus as well. As like I think it's the one thing that stands out that you mentioned is the fact that we should the so-called expert witness shouldn't be the one that makes the final decision, and that we as I want to say judge and jury needs to be informed, educate ourselves, and based on that make the decision.
Yeah, an informed decision. Now, the problem is, in general, people often do not have a wide knowledge, say, for example, about historical times, etc. So it's difficult to make those kind of decisions. But I think what we're showing today is that Christians can believe the Bible, and there's every reason to believe that the Bible is a trustworthy source of history. What is important is that different narratives about the biblical stories and history can be construed. Some of them are better than others. Not all of them are good. And we have to take into account all the different aspects that I've discussed. And from that, we can develop a good narrative. And that is important.
Willie, I want to thank you as a scholar. You have studied a lot you're a physicist, you are an expert in the science of, or the philosophy of science. You've done extensive study on the ancient world. You wrote a book on it. And it's so encouraging for us to hear that you firmly believe in the trustworthiness of the Bible. And thank you for that. I will sleep better tonight knowing that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to add that we'll put a link down to Willie's blog post. So anybody that wants to do some additional reading, there's a lot of articles that you guys can go to. And we'll also link to the Core Ideas website. And really, really worthwhile to spend some time on that website. There's some really, really good articles as well that covers these topics.
Thank you so much and all the best. And if you want to ask some questions, you can send your questions to info@thebiblegps.com. If you want to be notified when we get new YouTube videos and episodes, just click here to subscribe and you will get a notification.
And if you can please share it, that would be great.
God bless you.